On Joseph Jaffe is Not Famous today, I'm joined by Anu Gupta, author of Breaking Bias. We're diving into the role of spirituality and science in a divided world, the financial and social promises of breaking bias, and how to stay hopeful in the face of heartache. Let's get on with the show.
Oh, Joseph, you are still standing today. So we're gonna give you just a little bit of praise. A little bit of praise just for you. Well, you went and you survived, you know what? You know we gotta give you praise. Sing that name. Oh, Joseph, we praise you. And when we do, we'll make it rain. Oh, can I get an amen? Oh, you did it. You survived and you're still alive. Well, for all you do, we praise you.
Joseph Jaffe is not famous. I'm kind of famous. I'm Jerry Springer. And Jaffe is no host. He'd be lucky to be in my audience, let alone on my show. Well, maybe he's crazy enough to be on my show. I take that back. And that's not a good thing.
I just want you to know that I've practiced this word about 20 times to make sure that I did not mispronounce it.
I have a question. Has anyone ever said with all due respect and then not followed up with a zinger?
His side of the bed. If I come in and I'm on the other side, he will move it. Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Which side do you like? With all due respect, you make a good point.
Cheery Oreos! Toasted Oreos!
Mute. He's muted.
I love what he's saying. He doesn't need sounds.
You're so small, squishing your head, Joseph.
You can.
Do it with me, Joe.
With all due respect, you really do look handsome, Bruce. Cheery Oreos! Toasted Oreos!
Look at you. You are insane.
How did I do that?
You're
How did I do
insane.
that? You just made the intro reel. Yes, you did. You know, I get very excited when I try something new because isn't that the joy of life, right? Every morning we wake up and we get another chance to another swing, another at-bat. And today I tried something that some advice I was given, which is to start off the show. A lot of people, you know, we're the production team of thousands. Like I have a production team of number one. I do it all by myself. I'm like that band, you know, with the harmonica. I'm not Bob Dylan. The harmonica and the drum, and you know, every time I lift my leg, you know, you hear a squeak or a sound, or you know, let's not go down that road. And so today I tried to just do a little bit of a merchandising to give you a sense of what to expect in today's show. Now I'm thinking my little pea brain is saying to me, my Homer Simpson voice is saying, you better make sure that you discuss these things. Otherwise, people are going to go, but you promised. Anyway, I like the start, and I was able to walk and chew gum at the same time. As someone who can not only walk and chew gum at the same time, but is doing some amazing things when it comes to, and by the way, what a great book, Breaking Bias. I get it, Breaking Bad, Breaking Bias. I like it. That's what my son, who's a massive fan, said. You know, nice one, Anu. And I will not call him Andy, but I've been diving deep the Gupta rabbit hole, and I like what I see. We're going to be talking about his best-selling book. This book was one of the best books. It is one of the best books, as has been heralded by many smart people in this world. So he will be coming on the show soon. I like to start off my show with a little bit of a statement of, you know, my why. As a teacher, facilitator, and a coach, I help high aspiring entrepreneurs, owners, and their leadership teams get unstuck, return to growth, and become forever changed. What does it mean to be unstuck? Well, if you're stuck, obviously the best way is to get unstuck. And I started this show in March of 2020 when people were stuck at home, quite literally, but also stuck in general. And so many people, the thing is, you don't have to be standing still to be stuck. Some people, you know, are just moving all the time, but they're not actually getting anywhere. When we talk about growth, I've been privileged to be become a leadership coach in the last year and a half, helping small and medium businesses grow or return to growth. And then forever changed the name of my 6th book, How a Global Pandemic Changed My Direction, My Purpose, and My Life. And the formula, Anu and I were in the green room together talking about what we have in common: HPO, hope, positivity, and optimism. The formula is amor, veritas, and vigor. Love what you do, happiness, be true to yourself, your identity, your purpose, authenticity, and stay the course. And that's all about energy, all about stamina, endurance, and even resilience. I also spend some time in the Collective Cafe with a bit of social audio, just being able to spend time, showing people, helping people, because I do have a face for radio, and sometimes they just like the voice and the funny accent, my little made-up Staten Island accent. We do things like live book reads. At the moment, I'm reading Who, Not How, which is really just a great book that says, hey, whenever you get stuck, instead of obsessing and getting frustrated over how, all you need is a who. All you need to do is hire a who. It's very Horton, here's a who, I know. And there is also a podcast. So if you want to listen to me, if you can't get enough of me, why on earth would you want to, put yourself through this pain? But anyway, bit.ly/collective cafe to go to subscribe to the pod. And now it's time for our seated soliloquy. And the seated soliloquy today, always connected to my guest, is called Hope Springs Eternal. We're going to talk about hope when Anu comes on the show in just a few moments. And I was thinking that there are a couple of common things that come to mind when we hear hope. One is this, I don't know if it's cynicism, the one that says hope is not a strategy, right? You can't build your entire life, your go-to-market, your plan, even your life plan around hope. I don't know, maybe Anu disagrees with this. I hope he does to a degree, but certainly hope is not enough, just like love is not enough. These beautiful, powerful 4-letter words are very powerful, but you need more, right? You need action. Even when we think about breaking bias, just having all the intentions, all the hope, all the faith, it's got to be followed up and followed through with execution, with consistent execution. But this idea of hope springs eternal, I am a dreamer. I'm idealistic. I really do believe in hope. The essence of the show is HPO, hope, positivity, and optimism. You have to never give up, never give in, never run out of hope. You always have to believe in the good in people. You always have to believe that there is a glimmer, a spark of, I don't know whether it's redemption, a second chance, the ability to turn this Titanic around, whether that Titanic, I don't know how you define Titanism, I just made that up now, but this idea of sometimes feeling like you're out of control, going in one direction and not being able to slow down or turn that ship around. You have to believe. You have to believe in humanity, in the good of people. You have to hope for better days. You have to have faith for better days. And then you have to actually go about making sure that you're not a passenger, that you're not a spectator, that you are a pilot, a co-pilot, a driver, a navigator, that you can be part of the change. Don't turn a blind eye. Don't give up. Don't give in. And don't believe that you can't make a difference. Little old you, just you, yourself, me, myself, and I. Of course you can. And I think it begins with conversations. It begins by being open-minded. It begins by just creating that little inch, that little jar, that little ajar, that moment in the door, that little crack where there is the possibility that you may not be right and that somebody else may not be wrong. And maybe between the two of you, you can find some common and middle ground. But now it's time to find not just common ground, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of common common ground, but to welcome my very special guest, Anu Gupta. He's a lawyer, scientist, scholar of bias, meditation teacher, and the founder of Be More with Anu, an education technology company that trains leaders to advance inclusion and wellness by breaking bias. His work has reached 300 plus organizations, training more than 100,000 professionals and impacting over 30 million lives. That's like a Dr. Evil, 30 million lives. He is also, which is not to say he's evil, he is also the author of Breaking Bias, where stereotypes and prejudices come from, and the science-backed method to unravel them. And with a forward from the Dalai Lama, wow, he has been featured widely, including on the TED stage, the Oprah Conversation Time, and People magazine. And now, Joseph Jaffe is not famous. Anu, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for having me. I'm so delighted to be here.
Okay, so I'm just going to go straight away to how do you get the Dalai Lama to write a forward of your book, for your book?
I think I stay hopeful and optimistic. I send him an email, someone reads the email, and I continue to write to him. And once he read the book, he felt touched, and he wanted to offer a forward. And I'll say that I didn't even ask for a forward. I just wanted an endorsement. Something as simple as, good job. This is a book to read. Like I have all the endorsements from many other people. But I think the book really spoke to him, largely because, it's rooted in science, but also uses a Buddhist mind science perspective to really get to a very important challenge that we face as a species around the world: bias.
Well, before we get into that, I'm going to show my mischievous side, which is part of my special or species, the Jaffe Juice species, and we're going to just get to know the man behind the book.
Yeah.
A little section I like to call fun facts. Who knows what we've sent our investigators into the field. We've wiretapped phones. We've broken so many laws to find the dirt on you. And all we could come up with was three fun facts. First of all, and we thank our AI production team.
Oh my goodness.
or should I say, just my subscription to. But first of all, you've bungee jumped in Antarctica. So the only thing I'm thinking of is there any danger in terms of the cord freezing and snapping? That's all I could think of.
Well, I'll just say that not everything you find on the internet is true. So the question was, have I? So I feel like it could be true, it couldn't be true, but I think the freezing point is something that's part of the adventure.
So, I mean, have you bungee jumped in many countries before? I mean, or is it just like, do you collect bungee jumps, I should say?
Well, I will say that I think it was like 2 truths and a lie, right? So I think you have a bunch of other things.
I decided to scrap the lie. They're all true because I like them so much that I should have. Normally, I come up with a lie, and I'm like, you know what? To hell with the lies. Let's just find out more about Anu. I want to learn more with Anu.
Well, I'll be truthful here because that's part of my practice. I am terrified of heights, so I have never bungee jumped anywhere in the world.
So you know what? You actually caught me out on you sent me. This is the first time it's ever happened. I have to change it. Normally, what I do is I provide the lie, and in this case, I just love them. But I actually believe that you bungee jumped in Antarctica.
Oh gosh! So, well, the other two things weren't true.
All right. So wait. Hang on a second. You've eaten 4 goat hearts on a skewer.
I have. Yes, that was not very pleasant.
Why? How?
Well, after college, I worked in Myanmar. I started a nonprofit there working on issues of education and development and women's empowerment. And, I was working in a big school, like 7,000 kids, and wanted to connect with them. So one of the teachers was like, I have a treat for you. And she gave it to me. And I started biting into it. And halfway through, I was like, oh, what is it? She said, oh, these are goat hearts.
I mean, I don't think I could eat a heart. I don't think I could eat any heart of any
Right.
animal,
Yeah.
so I think I
Well,
might
when
have
you're
become
21 and
vegetarian.
adventurous, I have not eaten any hearts since, but that was, an
All right, so
experience.
at this point, I'm just convinced that you're a liar. So how do I even know that you've learned 8 languages over the course of your life? The only way, this is you superimposed against the Tower of Babel, is to ask you to, speak to me in 8 languages.
Oh, okay. Well, I've learned them, so I could start. Of course, I'm speaking to you in English. Then I grew up speaking Hindi at home. So, kya hal hai, aap kaise ho, which is just how are you? In
Gesundheit.
yeah. And then in college, I studied 3 languages, Spanish, Persian, and which is Farsi and Urdu. So that was really fun. ¿Cómo está? Halo shuma chaturid, you know, and Urdu is very similar to Hindi, so kaise hain aap? And then, after college, I lived in South Korea. So I lived there for a year. So I ended up learning Korean while living there. And actually, and before I went to college, I took Japanese. So I studied Japanese. So that's been, I don't know how many languages I'm up to, but those are like
Listen,
the big prominent ones. I've studied French and a few others here and there, Punjabi.
I'm impressed. There's probably a very natural connection, even to the subject of bias, of trying to understand people and connect with them. And clearly language is an important one. There's even the adage, or not the adage, but the story that if you go to France, and you just start to talk to a Parisian, let's say, in English, they're probably going to spit into your espresso or something like that. But even just going up to them and saying bonjour, I
Yeah.
wonder if you could help me. Even that in of itself is enough to endear them to you and at least create a bit of a connection. The importance of really trying to understand and learn someone else's culture, even if it's just a word.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so important because it basically communicates to the other person that I care about you and I care about who you are and I respect your being. So I'm making that effort to be with you and to, try to understand the perspective that you take. And I think for me, language learning was a way to really learn about other cultures, other types of people. And, I had a homestay when I lived in South Korea. I had 2 homestays. I was teaching at a middle school. And of course, I spoke not a word of Korean, and the people I was with didn't speak a word of English. And that's when I realized that, whoa, like people are people everywhere, regardless of the languages they speak, what they look like, who they love, what country they're from. And those are the types of eccentricities that we have as humans, regardless of where we go. And that really made me appreciate. And then that was part of my journey into coming to the work of, getting to the root cause of the many challenges we face, whether it's poverty or gender inequality or racial injustice or, the climate crisis around the world. Like, why is it that we continue to have these problems when we spend billions upon billions of dollars trying to come up with solutions to it? And you have the answer to that behind you.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking,
Yeah.
and of course, a little bit of Depeche Mode, people are people, so why should it be? But I'm going to ask you the question that you basically stated. Are we all the same? At fundamentally, are we
Yeah.
all the same?
Yes, at the genetic level, we are 99.9% identical, whether you're from Zimbabwe or Brazil or Korea. And that's something that's really important, particularly at a time of polarization and where, at least, in the country we live in, the US, there's quite a lot of xenophobia. And beneath the xenophobia are these really flawed stories, of genetic inferiority or superiority of certain races of people or certain groups of people. That's all flawed. It's just bad science. It's been terrible science. It's been around for 150 years. But, in 2000, the Human Genome Project showed that human beings are 99.9% identical, based on our DNA. And not only that, the 0.01% difference that exists between people of different ethnic backgrounds, people that are within the same ethnic group may have more differences between them than people across differences. So a Russian and a Kenyan may be more similar than 2 Russian people together. or two Kenyans together. And that's really important for us to understand, because why is that? Well, it's the mystery of nature, right? It's the mystery of existence. But for me, like, that's really important. And then I went into the genealogical way of looking at this. And there's a inquiry I make in the book, and I'd love to ask you. So if you think about yourself, Joseph Jaffe, right? The one human you are. If you think about yourself, you know, and all the ancestors that made you who you are today, how many ancestors did you have in the last 500 years? So 500 years ago, how many people existed that made the one human that you are now?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's in 500 years.
Yeah. So like 1525.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen this thing as well that actually says that shows you how the combination of how many people,
Yeah.
you know, and it's fascinating just to make one person. It's
Yeah.
incredible. The great grandparents,
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
6 generations, and you see like,
Yeah.
wow, what had
Yeah.
to go right
Well, for
or wrong with me?
500 years ago, there were 15 million humans that existed that made the one person that you are and the one person that I am.
Say that
And the
again.
more, there were
500
15 million people in 1525 that existed whose DNA you carry in your body.
Wow.
15 million. And then the more research and the more I go into the details of it, because I'm a lawyer by training and I love details, I'm like, oh my gosh, for me at least, you know, I started with myself. These humans were all of different backgrounds. You know, they were Muslim, they were Hindu, they were Sikh, they were Jain, they were Persian, they were North Indian, they were Punjabi, they were Tibetan, given where my family's from. And it's like, I'll never know. Of course, I come out looking like this because this is, you know, partly because of the last 4 generations, that's phenotype. But in our bodies, we have so much diversity. And it's not just true for me, it's true for every single human being. You just need one person, your great-great-great-great-great-grandparent, who was, I don't know, indigenous or was from Africa. You may not look it, but that still runs through it. For me, and that's really comforting, right? That type of knowledge. What I wanted to really talk about in the book is that we're all so deeply connected. And this is what every spiritual tradition has been talking about for generation, for millennia. And this is what the neuroscience has been showing for the last 30, 40 years. And I think for me, it's really important now to get on board with it and to really translate all this wisdom into action.
I want to actually, before we go down and talk about biases and prejudices, I want to just talk about stereotypes for a second, because, you know, we were talking in the green room, and I was saying I used to work in advertising, and in advertising, that's what we did. We had to stereotype. We had to be able to create at least a compound image. You're seeing one family. What does that family look like? Are they white? Are they black? How many kids? White picket fence, 2.3 dogs. You're trying to at least stereotype, if not your actual customer, your ideal customer. And then I want to triangulate this against, as a leadership coach now, one of the tests that we do is called Colby, which is, you know, like Myers-Briggs or whatever the case may be. And my Colby says I'm a low fact finder, I'm a low follow through, I'm a high quick start, and I'm about an average implementer. And I'm thinking to myself, as I'm listening to you, is that a bad thing, given the fact that there are 15 million contributions to me, to just be able to say, hi, I'm Joseph, and I'm a low fact finder, and I'm a high quick start, I'm a creative type, I'm a right brain type thinker, and that's how you should judge me and relate to me?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, there's no right or wrong, right? It's really the question that I like to ask is like, is it causing any harm? Is it causing harm to me, to self, or others? And that's where we really begin. And for me, like, stereotypes as a word actually comes from, you know, the advertising world, from the media world, right? In terms of creating copies. And it's disseminated by, you know, the media most generally, but also other root causes of bias. So I think for me, like, what are stereotypes? Stereotypes are basically, you know, generalizations that are false, that are made about an entire group of people. For example, all Asian Americans are good at math. Well, I'm one who's not, right? And you just need one exception, then it's not true. Yet we continue to hold these stereotypes, and they become the story and the lens through which we view one another. And it prevents intimacy. It prevents us from actually getting to know one another, to be with one another as we are, and we'd rather live in ideas of one another. And that's one of the challenges we face when it comes to gender, when it comes to sexuality, when it comes to nationality around the world, when it comes to age. The perceptions that we have, the stereotypes we have of people that are aging, right? People who are disabled. And part of, for me, this is one of the challenges for me has been, that's how I came to the work, is we sometimes internalize these stereotypes. We start believing these lies about ourselves. And that becomes internalized bias and has so many ramifications on our own mental health, on the way we relate to ourselves, the way that we make decisions about ourselves, about our life, and how we create, Hendrik Gaze talks about how we upper limit ourselves. And
I love that. Yeah. I mean, so this concept of like believing the lies, believing the biases, believing, I mean, this could be at so many levels, right? Societal prejudgments.
Sure.
You spoke about your story. I was watching in fact, I was watching your TED talk. And that's why I referred, when you started calling yourself or referring to yourself as Andy, and no matter what, you were prejudged. It didn't matter, in terms of whether it was the color of your skin or accent, etc. And then you came to a realization, which is no more Andy, I'm Manu.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for me, like I had to walk through my own like dark night of the soul. Like the story for me is that, I moved here to the United States when I was 10 years old. I'm an immigrant. And, suddenly coming from India, where I grew up for the first 10 years, the culture is very different. The society is very different. The people around me are very different. And I was different than most people that were around me. And I almost became an untouchable because of the way I looked, the way I talked, the way I dressed. And what I tried to do, in this moment of stress was to assimilate, try to be like others, get rid of my accent, dress a certain way, talk a certain way, walk a certain way. I was also being bullied for being perceived as gay for a while. I didn't even know what that meant. So one of my bullies actually told me in 7th grade, go home and look up the word gay in the dictionary, because I thought it meant happy. And I was like, why are people picking on me for being happy? Like, what's wrong with being happy? And when I went home and I looked at the dictionary, I was like, whoa, same-sex loving people, that's a thing. Like, I didn't even know that existed. And internally, I was like, oh, I am that. Wow. Like, first, it's like a moment of like relishing the fact that, oh, something I felt inside is actually a thing. It's not just me being crazy. And then being like, oh, wow, it's not safe to be this thing, because this is why I'm being bullied or being, beaten up or being called all sorts of names. So then again, using that experience to go into the closet and then perform a certain way. And as a man, for me, that was more about the way I talk, the intonations, the depth of my voice, the way I walk, the way I move my hands, like literally all of these things, being hyper vigilant about how I carry this body. And this really came to a head for me, right before I was starting my second year of law school, where I just couldn't take it anymore. Super depressed, super anxious. And I started believing that maybe there is something wrong with me. Like, I am the problem. Like, people are telling me I shouldn't feel this way, but I do feel this way. When I express myself, people don't believe me. So I found myself on the ledge of my my 18th floor window, lived in an apartment in Midtown Manhattan, about to jump off. But for whatever reason, I jumped, and instead of falling forward, I fell backwards into my apartment. This is where the spirituality piece comes in for me. Like, for me, there is no explanation as to why I'm here sitting across from you, Joseph, other than mystery or grace. And that moment, I called someone who I'd just met a couple of weeks prior. She lived quite far away from me, but she happened to be walking on my block, showed up in my apartment within 3 minutes. And the next day, I began my breaking bias journey. Went to the counseling center, NYU. And for me, like, wow, like, there's so much happening in the world. It could be a coincidence. We can call it serendipity. We can call it whatever, right? We have all these words. But as someone who like walked through that path, I was like, wow, like, this is way too much. And that really kind of, for me, then moving into my own breaking bias journey and to begin to see the lies I learned about myself, where those lies came from. But then also as someone who cared about service, who had worked internationally around the world, around economic development, and then was also training to be a human rights lawyer, I was like, wow, like, I see these same patterns. in the US, in India, in the Philippines, in Israel, wherever you go, everywhere. And what are these patterns? We can try to perfect the craft of policies all we want, but until and unless we shift the hearts and minds of the people that are executing on those policies, we'll continue to have human suffering. We'll continue to have inequities and disparities. And that's where I think for me, the science and neuroscience of implicit bias, unconscious bias was like, wow, like we got to do something about this. And what I was doing for my breaking bias journey was going to a lot of meditation retreats and mindfulness retreats and understanding the nature of compassion, how we cultivate it and joy. So these are some of the tools that I learned from the Dalai Lama, for example, and a lot of other practitioners. But the neuroscientists were showing that these same tools also help mitigate bias. And not only do they create personal healing, they can create social healing. And that's when I started my work in 2014. I was like, I got to just dedicate myself to this. This is my calling.
The overwhelming word that forms in my mind as I listen to you is the word self, as in self-awareness, self-discovery, self-love. The neuroscience and even the neuroplasticity element is about understanding what's going on inside my body. The spirituality may be talking about what's going on inside my mind. And I really love this fusion between spirituality and science. I'm curious as to how do you define spirituality in today's times? Obviously, we think about, there is religion, which can be worse, which can often be the problem as opposed to the solution. There's meditation, but how do you define spirituality in this context?
Yeah, I think it's just a beautiful question. I think for me, religion is something that's very institutionalized. It's systemic. It's something that has to do with rituals and customs and tradition, and it's rigid, right? There's very little flexibility. Whereas spirituality for me, and I would call myself poly-spiritual, as someone who kind of really borrows from a lot of different spiritual traditions, is having a sense of trust, confidence. We talked about hope. I think what underlines hope is really faith. But if people don't like the word faith, it's really confidence, trust, like knowing, right? Deep inner knowing in the body that there's something bigger that we're all part of. In South Africa, the word is Ubuntu. Like that spirituality, that there's this network of mutuality that we're part of. We're interdependent on the elements of the earth with other living beings that are not human and with all other human beings. We're part of the earth. We're made of the elements of the earth. We breathe, the air of the earth. So like, that's what spirituality is. It's like feeling that connection. And for some, it could look like, a creator, or God or what have you, this impersonal figure that for some it has forms, for others it doesn't have form, it's formless, but it doesn't matter what we call it. It's just that deep feeling of comfort and trust. And I think for me, that really came to a head because I had that super dark night of the soul. And I'm like, wow, like this was a moment of grace. Like, there's no explanation for it. And as a result of that, I found myself, being in so many different spiritual communities, whether they're Hindu or Christian or Sufi or Jewish or Buddhist, a lot of Buddhist retreats as well. Like, oh, wow, they're all talking about the same thing. Like the core essence of all of these traditions is the same thing: love, understanding, compassion, forgiveness. So we're like, wow, okay, we can all agree to these things, right? This is what we need to bring.
You would think, right?
Yeah.
It's very bohemian. It's very Moulin Rouge.
It is.
But so I want to actually reference something that I wrote in Forever Changed. And I start off by basically saying there basically are only three things that can bring the world together, right? The first you would think would be, and I wrote, the first is you would think is war in terms of being attacked and coming together. And there, the reference point in the US was 9/11, and specifically the fact that you would think the world, that we would unite as a people, certainly in the US, but clearly that created massive divisions in terms of going to war, not going to war, weapons, et cetera, et cetera. The second was a pandemic. And you would think that would bring the entire country or world together. And clearly that was anti and pro-vax and et cetera. And then in a very snarky way, I basically said, well, the third is basically an alien invasion. Those are the only three, right? It's war, pandemic, and alien invasion. And you can be sure that when the Martians arrive, we will be like, pro-frienders and anti zappers and we will figure out somehow how to politicize, weaponize, and screw the whole thing up. One might even argue that today the alien invasion is called AI. But I almost just wrote and said, we're doomed. We're absolutely doomed, because here is my unscientific Jaffe test, and we just keep on failing every time. Anu, what is going to bring us together? Will anything bring us together? Because we're not acting like we are truly, interconnected and interdependent.
Absolutely. I think so. One thing I'll start off with saying we're not doomed. So everyone,
thank goodness. Thank goodness.
Get off your high horses and stop getting worried.
That was a layup. That was a layup for you.
I think it's really important to know that, when we think about, for me as someone who's like deeply entrenched in facts and science, I talk about, the second chapter of my book is really how did we get to this point? It's really about the work of breaking bias, and the work that we all need to do right now is one of shifting consciousness. Eckhart Tolle talks about this in A New Earth. There's a new consciousness that's evolving. It's coming. It's slow, right? But for me, I wanted to give it some naming, some flavor. And what we need to really do is move from exclusion consciousness, this way of being that likes to dominate, that likes to compete, that's rooted in scarcity, that's rooted in hatred and entitlement, to inclusion consciousness, that's rooted in those beautiful tenets of every wisdom tradition and science itself, on truth, on facts, on love, on compassion, on forgiveness. And for me, this is where I found the commonality across the spiritual traditions, because they have named it. Ubuntu is inclusion consciousness. Thich Nhat Hanh talked about this idea of inner being. So it's a way of being, it's an outlook of the world. And the more research I did, I found out that a lot of indigenous people before pre-contact Europeans in the Americas in particular were rooted in inclusion consciousness. They were rooted in interbeing. And this was not a long time ago. This was 500 years ago. And for some, as little as 200 years ago. That's how their communities were structured. But they also called this, the idea of exclusion consciousness, they named it this term known as wetiko. It's an Algonquian word, and it really means it's a mind virus, which basically means that it could be transmitted from one person to another. And it's entrenched in greed. It's entrenched in ignorance, and it's entrenched in hatred. Wetiko. And that's basically been our human history, recorded human history of the last 5,000 years. We don't know what's before 5,000 years ago, because when it comes to the study of archaeology or anthropology, that's really rooted in evidence. But we don't have the evidence. We haven't discovered it yet. Now, what I'll say is that this is where the spiritual traditions come into place. In the Vedic tradition, in the Mayan tradition, there are cycles of humanity that come and go. And in the Vedic tradition that I'm most familiar with, because I grew up with it, there are yugas. These are long time spans. And what as history, what I know as history, is actually the Kali Yuga, which is the Dark Ages, age of ignorance, age of hatred. And for me, the good news is that the Kali Yuga, according to the book, The Holy Science, was actually over in the year 1700. And since then, we've seen an upward ascendance of interbeing, ending slavery, ending, women's suffrage, and then women's equality, LGBTQ rights, ending racism and apartheid. We've all seen this in the last 300 years. So there's an upward mobility, globalization, more exchange of ideas across cultures, more tolerance, more celebration. So we are part of that right now. And, and that's kind of where, for me, that's what gives me hope, and why breaking bias is so essential for these times, particularly for this century, because we have to overcome these long-standing, entrenched false beliefs, ultimately. So we have to basically correct misinformation, bridge the information gap, and we also have to bridge the empathy gap. What prevents us from feeling empathy for the other, who is suffering, not just other human beings, but also other living beings altogether. And that's kind of the work of, moving from exclusion to inclusion consciousness, to be rooted in Ubuntu.
You Ubuntu, I'm going to call you Anutu. You're going to get the, you're definitely, yeah, Anutu. You're definitely getting the horn. I love that, and I'm going to go spend some time learning about retico as well. Now, you said a phrase, a very triggering phrase to some, right? The concept of mind virus, because today it is referred to as the woke mind virus. You don't hear it, So this and so it got me to thinking. First of all, words matter. Language matters, right? I mean, you speak 8 or 9 of them as well, and it's so funny how words can themselves be politicized and weaponized. Even the concept of liberal, right? I mean, the idea of being liberal means open-minded. Conservative typically means closed-minded, but that's not the way that it is perceived from one side or the other side. So here we are operating at an unprecedented time in terms of polarization of opinion, where up is down, down is up. Literally one side says up, the other says down. If that first side changes it to down, the other one goes to up. So I'm curious as to, I mean, this conversation is happening at an unprecedented time where affirmative action, where DEI is being stripped away, where they're now classified as only 2 genders. I want to hear your point of view in terms of where we are right now, the woke mind virus versus the opposite of it. I'm not even sure what that mind virus is. To just kind of almost like give us a marker. Where are we in time, and how will history look back and remember this time, Anu?
Absolutely. I think there's a few things I want to say. First is it's all rooted in retico, right? It's rooted in separation and hatred. And the politicization of the word woke, for example, right? I never use the term actually, because for me, the goal was always to wake up, not be woke, because we're always constantly waking up. We're constantly seeing what we don't know. We're making the unconscious conscious, and we're evolving and growing. But I think what I understand from it is that, of course, it's become politicized and it's been really, really harmful. But I will admit that the liberal folks, the open-minded folks, the way they operated to bring this information into the world was also deeply entrenched in retico. It was entrenched in shame, blame, and guilt. And whenever we have this, I would say, the evil trinity present, it creates defensiveness. It creates war, because it creates a war within ourselves and within one another. So we can see, I feel for me, like as I think about, particularly in the Buddhist mind sciences, anything that happens in the world is a consequence of various causes and conditions. So those were the causes and conditions. And now what we're doing is we're bearing the fruit of those causes and conditions. When we think of any successful social movement of the past, particularly in the 20th century, whether it was the Indian independence movement or the civil rights movement in the United States or the anti-apartheid struggle, much of that was really rooted in humanism. Much of that was really rooted in understanding the humanity of the oppressor, of the one that was deeply entrenched in retico and was with hatred, right? Operating out of a worldview where they just weren't aware. So that's kind of one of the challenges that I think we all have to really wrestle with, which is why this work is such deep inner work. One of the challenges why this new mind virus has spread so much, first it was a woke mind virus, as you're calling it, but now it's the anti-woke mind virus that's spreading, right? Is because our bodies are incredibly disembodied. We've become very disembodied. We are not in our bodies for the most part. And I know what that feels like because I was that person. I was just operating here, neck up, but I forgot that I have a whole experience that's happening below the neck. And for me, this is why the invitation really is with the book, with Breaking Bias, with all of my work, is to give people the tools. Scientists have named them various things. I've combined those names to calling them the PRISM toolkit, So PRISM is an acronym for 5 tools that we can practice to become more embodied, to be in touch with our bodies, with our hearts, with our minds. So not just become mindful. Of course, mindful is really important because we have to be aware, but also become heartful, also become feltful, right? So it's all of those things together. So we can really respond to the situation as opposed to just reacting all the time. And it also really, yeah.
Did you say feltful, as in feel?
Yeah, like feeling, yeah. Yeah.
Feltful. I like that. By the way, I just realized hope, positivity, and optimism is the opposite or the antidote or the solution to shame, blame, and guilt.
Yes,
so
it
now
is.
we know it, right? So
Yes.
now we got the continuum. Now we can start to triangulate and find the solution.
I love it. And this is what the team does. You're absolutely right. I've been talking about this, and you've been talking to the solution for so long. And I think underneath hope, positivity, and optimism is faith in humanity, faith in our higher angels, faith in just whatever you want to believe in, right? Whatever you want to call it, but faith that things will get better. Dr. King often talked about, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it always bends towards justice.
Yeah.
And for me, I find a lot of comfort in that, because when I look at a lot of ancient spiritual wisdom, Vedic wisdom, that's what they're talking about. These are long yugas, thousands of years long, and consciousness is shifting, one person at a time, like the work you've been doing of bringing HPO to so many people. We're planting seeds. We're getting ready for the next thing, not just for the next 7 generations, which is what a lot of indigenous people think about. But I think for me, it's really thinking about the next 700 generations, because we're really building the infrastructure to create a world where we can all belong in the fullness of our diversity.
I didn't want to forget to tell you, but I'm sure you're familiar that there is a I forget where it is, an indigenous tribe where if anybody takes more or has more than they need, they actually consider it to be mental illness. They actually regard someone having more than they should have as mentally ill. And I just was fascinated by that connection. Wow. I mean, when we think about the world now, I mean, there are a lot of mentally ill people.
Yeah, we're living in the world of excess, right? And a lot of these are learned habits. And so I'll get to one thing that I haven't done yet is define bias. What bias is these are learned mental habits, that distort how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions. So there are conscious biases, which are learned false beliefs, believing that men are more competent as business leaders than women. Completely false. There's no evidence behind it, but people want to believe it. False beliefs, great. But then there are unconscious biases, which are learned habits of thoughts. These are associations, right? In the book, I have a bunch of examples like, when we think of a certain profession, who comes to mind? A yoga teacher. What's the gender of the person that comes to mind? What do they look like? Do you think of an Indian man, right, as a yoga teacher? Because those were the dudes that pretty much, kept this tradition alive for thousands of years. So that is unconscious bias. And for us, the thing is, just as they're learned, they can be unlearned. And that's really the invitation for us. And when we notice that we have these unconscious biases, that we have these associations, it's so important not to shame ourselves. It's so important not to feel guilty. Rather, we just bring them into awareness. So that's the mindfulness piece. We bring it into awareness, and then we can practice the S of PRISM, which is stereotype replacement, which is basically creating new mental models. If all you can think of are like American women or English women when you think of yoga teachers, well, just do a quick Google search and find real life example of Indian men or Chinese men or African men who are also yoga teachers, right? So you're just building that library in your own mind. And that's what at the neural level, what it's doing, it's decreasing the neurons that fire together, wire together, that neural circuitry, and it's making it more dynamic. And that's kind of, for me, the work of our century, particularly at this time.
and ironically, when we go back to advertising, the whole essence of advertising is to break through the clutter. The one way to break through the clutter is to be different. Is to be surprising, to surprise someone and give them something that they just didn't expect. And it's not that hard to be able to just, cut against or swim against the current, cut against the grain. By the way, another acronym which I found out is Be More with Anu. Be More stands for breathe, empathize, mindfulness, objectivity, reframing, and expanding.
Wow.
We're just dropping these little crumbs for people to buy the book and follow you and subscribe. Subscribe to your Substack and
Yes,
and become part of the conversation, no doubt.
Yeah, no, and I think it's really, really exciting because, when we think about advertising, that's what I talk about, that there's any kind of bias anywhere in the world. For me, this book was really important because first I was just talking about race and gender, but then I realized this conversation is so much bigger than that. It's about age, it's about disability, it's about ethnic, groups, religious groups in different parts of the world. So I wrote this book so anyone, anywhere in the world, like if you're a Kurdish person in Turkey, if you're a Chinese person in Malaysia, you can read this book and really be like, oh, this is how bias operates in my country. And here's what I can do about it, right? Because any kind of bias that exists anywhere in the world, whether it's around gender identity or sexuality or age or ethnicity, has 5 causes, just 5 causes. And just as there are 5 causes, there are also 5 solutions, the PRISM tools. So for me, it's really about, using the language of advertising, for example, using kind of the limitations of our own brain power, but using that for our advantage so we can really hack these systems and to create a world where that's more efficient, that's more equitable, but also we can save so much more money. In America, every year we lose $2 trillion because of racial bias alone. And economists have extrapolated these studies. Bias is expensive. It is incredibly inefficient. So if we really cared about money, which we say we do as a capitalist nation, we would address this topic, right? And this is kind of my hope, really.
It also, I mean, the one thing I was thinking is, I think, first of all, I want to make 2 points. One is, and I hope people that are watching and listening to this pick up on the point, is that the elimination of shame has to, and shaming or being shamed, it has to happen on both sides.
Yes,
so
right.
Shame on us if we shame others, and
That's
certainly
right.
if we are shamed by others. But there's
That's
also this idea of giving ourselves grace and not feeling ashamed as well.
That's
And
right.
and I think inherent in that is, so on one hand, I think we always have to ask ourselves, are we becoming the enemy? Are we that which we once despised? Number one,
That's right.
we got to be able to hold up that mirror.
That's right.
Number 2, it just strikes me that I think we have to also accept our biases. I was thinking, if I'm walking down the street and it's or down an alley and it's dark, and I see someone and I see someone walking towards me, and they're wearing a hoodie and they seem to be darker skin, what do I do in that situation? Should I be ashamed to even think? Should I cross the street? How does someone in that situation act or react? Should they just keep walking straight to say, hang on a second, that's bias right now. I should not feel this. When a fight or flight reaction says, I need to cross the street, is it a catch-22? How do you deal with the fact that we have these inherent latent biases in us right now?
Well, I think in those moments, right, because it's happening in the moment, your body is giving you a cue. It could be conditioned, but you do what's best for you, to make you feel safe. So yeah, you cross the street, but you also become aware that, oh my gosh, this is stemming from this belief that I have. It's stemming from these unconscious biases that I may have learned through the media, through education, through social contact. But part of it is just accepting that. But over time, it's really about breaking biases on day to day, and then really understanding where these biases come from. And for me, those are more harmless, day-to-day harmless situations, right? Because we don't know the stranger. What's really important around this work that I've been doing for 10 years, 11 years, is that when a teacher is in a classroom and she is,
Right.
Grading papers, how is that subjectivity becoming biased? When a doctor is prescribing medication, how is she being biased when she's prescribing medication for, a woman or a man or a Black person or a white person or an Asian person? When a managing director, is hiring for people, How are, because these decisions matter, and they can sometimes be life or death. So that's where I think it's like we kind of go to those everyday situations. Yes, please listen to your body, do what feels safe for you. But I think part of the importance of this work is the day-to-day, right? If you're a pastor or a minister or a therapist, how is that coming into the people you're counseling?
Right. It's acceptance and awareness, but not static, with a view. There's got to be a commitment and a view. And I feel, and in other words, what you're saying is just being aware of that is itself a step in the direction to say, what is going on here? How might this change? And what is the impact on those around me? And of course, you know, the juxtaposition, even in the book, between the individual and the systemic or institutionalized. I feel like I could talk to you for hours, and maybe you'll have to come back anytime, Anu.
Yes, please. I love this.
But
HPO
you know,
all the way.
I'm telling you, I always find a quote, and I just had to share this quote with you. Reality has a well-known liberal bias. This is Stephen Colbert. So, you know, I mean, I like it because it's snarky. It's a little self-deprecating as well. Clearly inherent in the sentence or in the quote is the problem and the solution. To just say, of course, that, you know, liberals happen to be closer to reality. The reality is, yeah, I suppose, but not really. But I get it. You know, I get the joke, right?
And I think part of it is like, what is the disagreements that we have oftentimes are over words. So part of it is like, we need to be in conversation across difference to really begin to solve it. But that requires both parties to really acknowledge the humanity of one another. And, you know, and that's kind of the work that we are really going to be needing to do in the coming decades. I want to read one quote that's, you know, is appropriate. It's in the book. It's in the last chapter. It's by Grace Lee Boggs, who is an incredible Chinese-American author, an activist, and a philosopher. And she writes, "People thought of revolutions chiefly in terms of taking state power. But we've had revolutions, and we've seen how the states which they have created have turned out to be like replicas of the states which they opposed. You have to bring these two words together and recognize that we are responsible for the evolution of the human species. Revolution. Recognize the evolution. It's a question of two-sided transformation and not just the oppressed versus the oppressor. We have to change ourselves in order to change the world."
I love it. Recognize the evolution. And you know, and the revolution will not be televised. But I know I want to ask you just a couple of maybe lighter questions or questions just as we you know, just some personal questions as we wind down. First of all, can you name a time? I'm sure there are many. Whether it's one that really was formative in your life, or quite frankly, more recently, where you have operated under a bias and recognized your own bias in terms of, you know, in terms of your behavior.
Yeah, you know, it's actually what's coming in. The first thing that came up for me was more recent. So, you know, I have a partner, you know, we've been together for a while. It's been lovely. But I've begun to notice, you know, when I misspeak or use unskillful speech, particularly something that bothers him, you know, I'll call it little, like these little things. And I was like, wait, this is so deeply entrenched in bias, because what feels like little to me is really big to him, right? So it's a way of diminishing another person's experience, right? And I think that was really telling for me. That's like, oh, this is where, like, you know, our siloed way of thinking can really get to us. And I think acknowledging that, recognizing that, and not shaming myself over it, but being like, oh, this is happening. This has been a habit. But now the more I recognize it, the more I can change it.
That's a fantastic, it's a fantastic answer. And of course, I'm internalizing it, thinking about my own relationships with my own family, with friends, with colleagues, etc. Who are we to determine what is little? And yeah, that's great. Here's another one. Here's another thought, which is, if you could, you know, wave your magic Anu wand, you know, what do we call it? Anutu, not Ubuntu, but Anutu.
Yeah.
If you could remove one bias from society, forever remove it, gone, you know, never to come back again, one and only one, what would that be?
It's a great question. I think it's kind of our thirst for money. So like capitalism, like not the system of like I believe in it, but just like the unceasing desire for it with no limits whatsoever. Because, and the reason why I think that's the one bias that I want to really address is that because it's almost like we've been hypnotized as a society, as a global collective, to just seek this one thing, and we forget everything else. We forget to look at the sky. We forget to like enjoy the sun. We forget to be with our kids, with our partners, with our friends, and our whole lives go. And then when we're on our deathbeds, we're just like, oh, I spent all that time making money, but those are not the things that I really cared about, right? So I think like just kind of coming out of that would be like incredible. It's important, but it's not the thing.
It's terrible to have to end, to just end our conversation, because that is such a, I mean, again, we could spend an entire hour. I've spent a lot of my time thinking about what I call the evolution of capitalism. We is greater than me, and what that looks like. But I think it really does come down to, I'm going to leave you with a thought, almost like this idea that when we can pick it up next time. And the word is sufficiency. What is enough? How much is enough? And how do we ever know when we've satiated, when we're at a point where we can truly look back without any regrets on, I'm sure you're familiar with you know, the whole concept of SPIRE, right? Spiritual, physical, intellectual, relational, and emotional. Sufficiency. As these genetic beings, when will we be satiated, my friend?
I think you're calling a new movement of enoughism.
Enoughism. Well, I will never get enoughism of you, Anu Gupta. Okay. You can follow. Hey, I want to ask you one more question, just as we wind down, because it's, damn it, it's my show, and the only producers in my ear are the voices in my head, and there are many. Which is just random question, but how and why are both of us still even on X?
Yeah, I will say that for folks that are watching,
I asked it in a biased way, which is
well, I'm not active on X, so if you're trying to connect with me, please connect with me on Instagram or LinkedIn. Yeah, those are the two that I'm on. I'm still on X because, you know, I'm of the kind that, you know, I don't push people out of my heart. I don't like, you know, so I just think that it's an important place to remain. It is a public square, and right now it's being operated in a way that I don't agree with, but that doesn't mean it can't change in the future, right? So I think it's that's kind of why, but I'm not active on it for sure, because just to kind of protect my own mental health. And
yeah, and we have 22,000 people watching on X right now. So
exactly.
You know, so there you go.
Yeah, good for you guys. You know, please, thank you for watching.
His name is Anu Gupta. Do not ever call him Andy, because then I will hunt you down. And his book, it is a best-selling book, and it is regarded as one of the best books of the last year. It's called Breaking Bias, where stereotypes and prejudices come from, and the science-backed method to unravel them. Remember, this is a beautiful combination of heart and mind. It is a beautiful combination, a marriage between science and spirituality. You can follow him and all of his thought leadership and vision, not only on Instagram and LinkedIn, as he said, but also his Substack. And if you'd like to hire him or work with him, just go to bemorewithanu.com. Anu, I can tell you it was a pleasure. You have one new friend, one new fan. Actually, I lied. You have two, because the other one is Chuck Norris.
You are Chuck Norris approved.
And we will be back soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching the show about hope, positivity, optimism, and if there's time left over, a little bit of marketing with your host, multiple author, and global keynote speaker, Joseph Jaffe. If you like the show, tell a friend or two. Please subscribe to the show, and if you want to get inside news, previews of upcoming guests, and much more, visit josephjaffe.com/subscribe to sign up for the show's newsletter.
And despite the best ministrations of your wife, you still look ugly.